Hello, comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Shatella. My name is Akile Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. These studies are so important, and we encourage you right now to invite your friends and family to it. This week, Chairman Omali Shatella continues reading from Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, Chapter 10, The Question of the Nation, picking up from page 354. For the first study materials, and in the second hour is dedicated solely to you, our live viewers, to ask your questions for the chairman. Now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the African Revolution, our chairman, Omali Shatella. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, thank you, Comrade Director Keeley. I want to welcome all of you party members, members of the Uhuru movement and supporters of our party and our movement. Comrade Keeley has just introduced the discussion that we're going to be continuing on today. I just want to reemphasize the significance of these discussions. This is not just an exercise in intellectual stimulation. What we're involved in doing is really equipping members of our party and our movement for the incredible task that's before us now, and giving direction, leadership to this ongoing process of spontaneous eruptions that continue that have not yet completely abated, and also providing the kind of leadership and education that contributes to our ability to govern, because what we are talking about is the actual capture of political power, without which none of this makes any sense at all. And this discussion revolves around the issue of the nation. It's not an empty discussion. It's not so that we can call ourselves different things just to show that we are not like the rest of the people in the neighborhood or in the school that we attend, or something to that effect. This is a really important question. This discussion of nations and nationality is something that for the last couple of hundred years has actually determined how the world looks today, and it will determine how the world is going to look tomorrow. It is our responsibility as the Advanced Detachment, the leader of the revolutionary process that will liberate Africa and unite Africa and our people around the world. It's our responsibility to understand this question for really its practical implications. As we said, African internationalism is a theory of practice. It's not just about bandying about abstract concepts that don't have a relationship to practice, to how we are going to move ourselves forward, how we're going to move our people, our nation forward. So that's something that we think is really important to emphasize, to reemphasize, to help us grapple with this. Because as we've said previously, the African working class, the working class in general, in all countries, have been pushed out of the process of theory, dealing with theory directly, producing theory directly. We have been victims of theory that's been imposed on our existence, on our lives by rulers, and our rulers haven't been forces that are friendly to our interest as a people and as a class. So that's why we're dealing with this whole question. And the nation is a theoretical question in so many ways, but it's not just theory. And we open up this chapter talking about how Brzezinski, Victor Brzezinski, who had one time the national security advisor for James Earl Carter when he was president, and then had become an advisor to Barack Hussein Obama. And I feel like one of the most preeminent of thinking representatives of the bourgeoisie, one of the clearest. But Brzezinski, we opened up this chapter with quotes from Brzezinski, who was saying that the era of imperial domination, the era of empire is ending, has ended, is ending, and that this whole question of identity, the whole question of borders, these are things that are left over from imperial domination. And with the growing political consciousness of peoples around the world, all of this is being challenged. And so he recognized that it's a practical discussion that that most of what we characterize as national borders and even nationality is something that is disputable. It's not like there's some biblical reference that has predetermined who we are as a people and what our world is like. So we're going to go ahead and start. And I'm starting off actually on page 353, just a little earlier, because page 53 gives me an opportunity to reference Pan-Africanism, which is not a revolutionary, it's not even a theory, in fact. But it references Pan-Africanism because Pan-Africanism has been seen as something that is contending with African internationalism, which is the philosophy of our party, which we consider to be 21st century African fundamentalism, which was a theory that guided the movement of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey was clear, and so are we on the differences. And so starting on page 353, at the near the top of it, we go, people ask, can there be revolutionary Pan-Africanism? And this is a quote, by the way, from something that we had written earlier in something titled Pan-Africanism, African Internationalism versus Pan-Africanism. And the question, we go here, the quote, people ask, can there be revolutionary Pan-Africanism? I think that's an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Pan-Africanism does not have the ability to recognize the class question. Therefore, whoever wants to be a Pan-Africanist can be. Kwame Nkrumah was a communist, but I've been in London with people who call themselves Pan-Africanists who are anti-communist. A Pan-Africanist is whatever someone who calls himself a Pan-Africanist wants to be, unquote. Pan-Africanism liquidates the class contradiction that's killing us all over the world. To win the total liberation, unification of Africa and consolidate our nation, we have to be absolutely clear. African internationalism informs us that the African working class aligned with poor peasants must unequivocally lead the struggle for African liberation. Every other class force wavers in its loyalty to imperialist white power that affords them the promise of material or other benefits at the expense of the suffering African working class and the subjugated African nation. The success of the Garvey movement and its program is the best concrete evidence of the sense of sameness experienced by Africans worldwide. The UNIA was an organization of several million members and supporters throughout the world, including Australia. Its influence continues to be experienced by Africans even today, a century after its founding. The Garvey movement's 1920 convention of the Negro peoples of the world, held in Manhattan at Madison Square Garden, attracted between 25,000 and 50,000 people from throughout the African world. This was an amazing accomplishment at a time when communications and transportation were considerably more difficult than they are today, and our national oppression placed formidable constraints on our mobility, both within the US and in the colonial territories in Africa and elsewhere. The historic Garvey Movement Convention was the only place in the world that afforded Africans a democratic opportunity to vote their political preferences. Marcus Garvey was elected the provisional president of Garvey by convention attendees, and the red, black, and green flag was adopted as the national colors for African people. It was also at this convention that the delegates enthusiastically adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World as their program, giving political definition to the collective national interests of the struggle of Africans worldwide. The 1920 Garvey Movement Convention addressed the common issues of oppression and resistance. It cemented a united world African consciousness and expression of power that sent the Communist Party scurrying to the US government to collaborate in the attacks that would imprison and deport Garvey and destroy the Garvey movement. The crushing of the Garvey movement took the combined endeavors of the US and other imperialist governments of the time, along with a motley assortment of enemies of various hues and ideological leanings. who were all opposed to the notion of our national liberation as Africans. With the destruction of the Garvey movement, with the dreams of African people who aspired to consolidate the African nation, an aspiration left to our party to accomplish. The African nation and community and commonality of culture. The African nation is real. It is distinguished by a number of elements, both objective and subjective. Clearly, there is a sense of sameness, something that Europeans and Negro scholars often pretend does not exist, but which nevertheless exposes itself to public view every time Africans come to harm from or achieve victory over imperialist white power. Yeah, there is a sense of sameness, deep, and so Africans who never think of themselves as Africans, who never consider the so-called national question, but who see attack on African people, whether it's something like the New Orleans hurricane, Katrina. Africans all around the world experienced that as something that was happening to us collectively. And when we see and can visualize brutality imposed on Black people any place on earth, we experience that as a part of us, because there is a sense of sameness that is there. And that's something that's undeniable. So we say, few quibble that Black people, and even the question of victory, we're talking about when bad things happen to us, but when we can see a victory by Black people over our oppressors, that is something that we experience as happening for us as a people together. So few quibble that Black people in Africa itself are some variation of African, although sub-identities of ethnicity or tribe and or religion often challenge the significance of the fact that they are African. The colonial dividing borders imposed on Africa by Europeans are part of the parasitic process of achieving European national identity through destroying the African collective identity and facilitating the colonial theft of African resources. There's a material relationship here with this whole, the subjective character. One function of the borders has been to prevent the consolidation of a single continental-wide national economy that would be the primary material foundation of national unification, including one African language. The commonality of African culture and language would consolidate, develop, and flourish under the influence of African self-serving economic forces unleashed from the distorting, limiting imposition of borders that divert all things of value to the service of external forces. Historically, our resources and labor have benefited Europe and China, and Europeans primarily. But today, this increasingly involves China, India, Turkey, and every imperialist aspiring predator capable of entering the feeding frenzy on Africa's soil. Let's see this again. It said, historically, our resources and labor have benefited Europe and Europeans primarily, but today, this increasingly involves China, India, Turkey, and every imperialist aspiring predator capable of entering the feeding frenzy on Africa's soil. In the US, it is generally agreed that Africans constitute a distinct community with a distinct history and culture. No scholarly studies are needed to make this point. There is disagreement, however, of course, on the question of whether these distinct features contribute to the definition of Africans as a distinct nation. Some of the problems surrounding this question in North America revolve around two issues. One is the fact that Europeans themselves are new to this continent, having wrenched it from the custody of the indigenous people through brutish, horrendous, genocidal aggression that contributed to the culture of violence that defines the European nation. To admit that Africans constitute a nation is to thrust to the surface the underlying question that the white nation cannot tolerate, namely, if they are Africans, then who are we? Secondly, there is the question, and that is a fundamental issue, that is very difficult for Europeans to acknowledge and recognize the fact that we are Africans. Because the unstated question is, if we are Africans, then who the hell are they? And that's a part of the dilemma that Europe and Europeans have. Secondly, there is the question of the size and viability of the African population in the US. Of course, there are more African people in North America than white people in some European countries that pose as nations. Nevertheless, Africans are held to a different standard on this issue. This takes us back to Garvey and the UNIA. This takes us back to the African People's Socialist Party and the African Socialist International. This takes us to the recognition that the African nation is not confined to the borders imposed on us by Europe, whether in Africa or the various places to which we have been forcibly dispersed. We say this again. This takes us to the recognition that the African nation is not confined to the borders imposed on us by Europe, whether in Africa or the various places to which we have been forcibly dispersed. And as African internationalists, we recognize that the basis of our struggle is the European attack on Africa. We recognize that the basis of our struggle is the European attack on Africa, the forced dispersal and colonization of untold millions of its inhabitants, and the creation of artificial borders used to facilitate the alienation of Africans from each other, from our resources, and from our national identity. These borders contribute to alienating Africans from not only things like our resources and from each other, but it also alienates us from our national identity, our identity as a group. Our position here does not ignore the fact that false national consciousness has been imposed on Africans worldwide through the violence of the imperialist state and imperialist imposed ignorance. In West Africa, there's a territory known as Cameroon, named for the Portuguese word for shrimp, after the Portuguese colonizers discovered an abundance of shrimp in its waters. The fact that there are thousands of Africans there that refer to themselves as shrimp does not make them shrimp any more than an African in England is a Black Brit, or an African in the US, a Negro or African American. Africans throughout the world continue to exist under some form of colonial domination. In this era, that takes the form of indirect or neo-colonial rule by the European imperialist state in disguise. The capitalist imperialist state, unlike its feudal predecessor, was born as an international state through imperialist colonial slavery, the foundation of capitalism and the European nation. So unlike the state in Europe and other places, the capitalist imperialist state was born as an international state. Capitalism was born as an international entity. It was a global entity. It did not come into existence as a US or British or Portuguese entity. It's a global entity. So the bourgeois state manifests itself in Europe as relatively benign in relation to white people. In Nigeria, Sudan, and all of Africa, as well as in Ireland, India, the Middle East, Asia, and in all the colonized territories of this planet, including inside the US, the North American European imperialist state has been highly armed and unremittingly violent. Hence, the British state that was vicious in its colonies bragged about police not carrying guns in England. That is, until their colonial subjects immigrated to England in enough numbers to create domestic colonies like the ones found in the US since its bloody advent through genocide and colonial slavery. And the only reason that this happened in England is that, especially after the Second Imperialist World War, where much of Europe, including England, was destroyed, and then it was necessary to have people come in and rebuild England, just as Africans in this country were necessary for the increase in productivity subsequent to that same war, due to the fact that England and other European colonial powers had lost complete control of those colonies, and resources were now coming to the US, and they needed to get Africans to come from the South to the North to work in these factories and things like that to increase their capitalist productivity. The same thing, a similar thing happened in England and Europe. And now England needs Africans, in fact, put out the call, come home, come home. That is to say, Africans in the colonies were lured to come into England because they needed workers to rebuild England, and that happened in other places, Europe in particular. So now you have a domestic colony growing inside the borders of England, just as what has occurred historically inside the United States. So, like we said, I want to read this paragraph again quickly because I really want to finish this chapter so that we can get down to raising the kinds of questions that you might have revolving around this chapter and any other thing that you would want to raise. The bourgeois, I want to say, comrades, that this issue of theory is fundamental. It's not a small issue. And at a time like today, when the imperialist world is experiencing incredible, some ways you can say contraction. Certainly, it is in a state of stress. When this is happening, and you see struggle and virtually challenging the imperialist domination of the world as it has been constructed, certainly over the last 70 years or so or more, then the possibilities of revolution of Africans entering into this fray is greater than any time before. Right now, I mean, we've seen like a coup, for example, that just happened in Mali. Well, the guy who led the coup, the military force, the soldier who led the coup, was trained by the United States and in the United States. And Mali is a French-speaking territory historically under colonialism controlled by France. Similarly, you have other territories just like this. And so you have the United States challenging the situation in Mali, where African people have been fighting against the status quo there for a long time. Sometimes the US calls them jihadists and they call them terrorists, because anybody's a terrorist who scares white people or who scares the leadership or challenges the existing structural relationships that the imperialists control for world domination. That's a terrorist. And so these struggles have been going on. And so the US and France have been vicious in trying to determine who, and trying to maintain the imperialist or white or European control there. And sometimes the US and France will collaborate, and sometimes, and most times, they're in contention with each other about who is going to control these specific territories. So the US and France, there's no doubt that they're involved. As you know, just a couple of years ago, we saw for the first time, many people in this country and around the world learned that there are thousands of US troops who are traveling all over Africa, even as we have this discussion, engaged in attacking different forces who would think about being free, setting up the stage to protect the status quo, sometimes the existing neo-colonial bosses there. And then there's the struggle between the United States and China, the struggle between the United States and Russia, the struggle, the emergence of Russia as a contending force for the United States, not only in places like Syria and the Middle East, but also contending with leadership in parts of Europe. This is a critical moment in history, similar to that moment that we just talked about when we saw the rise of the Garvey movement. So you got all these forces contending. You got Turkey in Africa, you got India in Africa, you got Canada in Africa, you got France in Africa, you got Belgium in Africa, you got Germany in Africa, you got America in Africa, you got England, and all these forces are moving around, and they are moving around their own interests, and they are upsetting some of the pre-existing relationships. And Africa cannot be this static force, and Africans can't be this static force. And as African internationalists, we understand that what's happening to African people anywhere has implications for the liberation of African people everywhere. And that is particularly true on the continent of Africa, and it's particularly true inside the United States, that is currently the shaky hegemon of the whole world economy and the whole world political configuration. That's all of that's up for grabs now. And there are different forces in motion around the world who contending to see if they have the guts, the ability to challenge the hegemony of the United States. And there are different forces who are sitting on the sidelines, seeing if China or if Russia or some of these other forces will be able to successfully do that. There are people who are pushing the idea of a multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar world that's controlled just by the United States. And where is Africa and African people? Well, African people is in the African People's Socialist Party, the African Socialist International. It is in African internationalism. It is in recognizing that we have to consolidate a revolutionary party spread throughout the world, such as what Garvey had created, that can actually initiate an actual struggle to take power. And this can't be any dilly-dally or wishy-washiness around this question. When we say that we are African internationalists, we are expressing who the hell we are in terms of who our theoretical grounding. We say this is what promotes what it is that we do. This is what guides what it is that we do. This is how we measure whether or not we're being successful or not. This is what tethers us. This philosophy tethers us to a predictable future that we are fighting for. And most organizations that you're talking about can't do that. They don't even have a philosophy. For the most part, they borrow a philosophy from the ruling class, from sector of the ruling class. And Pan-Africanism is an example of that occurring. And so Pan-Africanism gets born by a sector of the African population, the petty bourgeoisie, that has been forced to recognize the significance of an all-African relationship in some way or another, that has been forced to recognize how the notion of African solidarity, unity excites the imagination of Black people from the smallest village on the continent of Africa to a community in East New York in the United States. That this is an exciting thing, that African people want this. Garvey understood this. We understand that, and the petty bourgeoisie is forced to recognize this, but they want to recognize it without having to have revolutionary overturning of the whole social system that would put the workers and peasants, the majority of the people in the African world, the majority of the people upon whose labor and resources the entire capitalist system relies on. This is not what this petty bourgeois force wants, even though they can talk about a Pan-Africanism. And it doesn't say anything about the nature of the social system being fought for. It can't. Its basic obligation and interest is just to unite all the Black people under the leadership of the African petty bourgeoisie, because that's what it is. If you're not talking about revolution, if you're not talking about the working class, then the only social force that's there is this primitive force that's called the petty bourgeoisie, and it's primitive because it's not a real bourgeoisie. It's defined in relationship to its relationship to colonial white power. On the other hand, you have these forces who really are crypto-Americans. They are hyphenated Americans of some sort. They are African Americans. They are Black Belt South, New Africans, or something to that effect. But they definitely are not involved, are not desirous of a revolutionary outcome that might suggest that they might have to pack up and leave and go home to Africa. It's not even that we are not suggesting that, but they're not taking any chances. So they want to give this nonsensical retort to the slogan by Garvey of Africa for Africans at home and abroad. They come up with this retort that, well, we used to be Africans, but we've been transformed through slavery into something else. Now we are new Africans, or we are the Black Belt Negro nation, or something to this effect. These are simply pseudo Americans. These are crypto Americans. These are people who don't want to give up Kool-Aid and whatever else comes with the American dream, so to speak. So this question of philosophy is extremely important because it tells us where the hell we want to go. And how in the hell would you settle for a barbecue stand in Mississippi when you've got 12,000 square miles of value that all the powers in the world want to take from Africa? And Africa is the birthright of every living African person, even Africans who've not been born. It's our birthright. And I'm not just speaking subjectively about this, because our future depends on how this whole question of nationality is approached and resolved. And so I want to go further, if I may. So we say, hence the British state that was vicious and its colonies bragged about police not carrying guns in England. That is, until their colonial subjects immigrated to England and enough numbers to create a domestic colony, to create domestic colonies like the ones found in the US since its bloody advent through genocide and colonial slavery. The United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a host of international institutions, along with the US Africa Command, AFRICOM, and the various US and European military function as arms of a combined European capitalist state with the purpose of violently barring us from seizing control of our African nation. This is also the case for the neo-colonial African governments that for the most part rely on charity handouts from imperialist states or institutions for funding, training, and leadership. Nevertheless, we can say without hesitation that the African nation does exist. We are one nation in need of consolidation, a nation definable by objective and subjective characteristics, with features arising specifically in response to historical necessity, just like the European nation. While the objective material foundation of the African nation is fundamental, this does not limit or undermine the subjective elements, the sense of sameness experienced by Africans everywhere. The most important defining material or objective element of the African nation is its derivation from Africa, the national homeland of African people. This is the critical component of African identity, from which most of the subjective factors derive. The African nation is also defined in part by physiognomy. We are Black people of and from Africa, the equatorial continent. This common connection to Africa carries with it deep and profound cultural connections going back thousands of years, as previously not shown in the quote by Cheikh Anta Diop. In 1962, Joseph Kizerbo made similar assertions about the African nation, including in a 1975 anthology entitled Readings in African Political Thought. Kizerbo discusses in African Personality and the New African Society, quote, contrary to the colonial image, which presents pre-colonial Africa as a collection of tiny groups torn by internal strife and tribal warfare, sociologically frozen at the stage of a protozoan or an amoeba, African society was highly organized. Its principal features, in my opinion, were the following. First, the authority of the old people. In Africa, the hierarchy of power, of consideration, and of prestige was in direct rapport with the hierarchy of age. The Council of Elders in traditional Africa was the supreme political master of the city or the tribe. It was often this autocracy of the old that evolved into a veritable cult of ancestor worship. Another important characteristic of the traditional society is solidarity. And in this point is too obvious to require any lengthy explanation. I would, however, like to say that this solidarity is not just a phenomenon of the superstructure, a trembling of the spirit, or a tenderness of heart towards others. This solidarity is imprinted on the very basic structure of African culture, and especially its economic organization. You know that in the traditional African society, the notion of property was defined in terms of the family, community, or the village, and not in terms of the individual. The concept of personal property in terms of the individual was generally alien to African social concepts. Fields are often common property, and work is most often collective. Another social manifestation of this solidarity is hospitality, which, it is true, is obviously not an African monopoly, but which nevertheless is particularly strong there. And here I'm pleased to associate North Africa with the rest of the continent. Another important feature is the equalitarian character of African society. Naturally, I do not intend in any way to idealize or present traditional Africa as the best of all possible or imaginary worlds. Africa has had its tyrants, as have other nations throughout history. But it must be stressed also that the traditional African society often included classes based solely on functional differentiation. There was, for example, the Mason class, the blacksmith class, the warrior class. But the fact that in Africa property was common, the fact that there was no class that accumulated the capital property and reduced others to the state of mere tenancy, mere peasants or farmers whose toil was used to amass profit. Well, that fact proves that the exploitation of man by man never achieved the status of a system in the traditional society of Africa. And moreover, by reasons of the unlimited solidarity of which I have just spoken, the true principle of such a society was, to coin a phrase, to each according to his needs, to the extent of the complete utilization of common revenues, unquote. So who is an African? We can see our commonality in Africa, but as we pointed out earlier, no nation is defined solely in its relationship to itself. To say that the nation is one thing is to say that it is not another. Dark skin is a product of equatorial Africa, the land of Black people. So-called Black people among ourselves would be incapable of defining ourselves as such. It is through our relationship with so-called white people and the dialectic of the oppressor nation and the oppressed nation that Africans became Black. We can say, therefore, that the African nation is one born of its historical ties to its African national homeland, which, with a core sense of sameness that includes a common culture, history, and physiognomy. Still, to arrive at a full definition of the African nation, we must say more than this. The African nation is informed by historical necessity, determined by our condition of existence at this very moment, hundreds of years subsequent to our defining conflict with the European predatory nation. Europe's parasitic attachment to Africa and Africans shapes and determines both its successful existence and our national coherence. The Europe's parasitic attachment to Africa and Africans Europe's parasitic attachment to Africa and Africans shapes and determines both its successful existence and our national incoherence. A critical feature of our condition of existence as a people is the imperialist near total control of the economic life of Africa and African people wherever we are located in the world. Neither Africa the land nor Africans the people. Both fundamental components of the productive forces have been accessible to Africa for the production and reproduction of real life for Africa and Africans. Hence, Africa has created staggering wealth for imperialism that has benefited the entire European nation, ruling class, middle class, workers, and others at our expense. Hence, Africa has created staggering wealth for imperialism that has benefited the entire European nation, ruling class, middle class, workers, and others at our expense. Everything they have was stolen from our labor, resources, and knowledge. We have a historical mandate to take back what is ours and fulfill our destiny as a united, independent, self-governing nation in control of our own continent and future. This is an immensely profound reality that must be internalized by Africans and all peoples throughout the globe who have an interest in destroying forever this blood-sucking culture of violence stemming from European imperialism. Therefore, historical necessity, the absolute requirement of any people to produce and reproduce life as a condition of existence, survival, and a meaningful future requires the consolidation of the African nation. Let's say it again. Therefore, historical necessity, the absolute requirement of any people to produce and reproduce life as a condition of existence, survival, and a meaningful future requires the consolidation of the African nation. The consolidation of the African nation is a prerequisite for overturning the abject genocidal conditions of existence of Africans everywhere. There is no separate solution for the liberation of African people based on colonially defined borders or identity any place on earth. Clearly, the African liberation movement has run into its limitations when fought within the context of these borders. Civil rights and flag independence only serve to obscure our oppressive exploitation, not overturn it. Millions of Africans have been forcibly dispersed from Africa throughout the world. European and others have come to Africa, some as colonizers, some as subjects or of colonial powers who were allowed privilege in Africa as intermediary colonial agents, functioning as buffers between Africans and our oppressors, a situation contributing to African dependency and the atrophy of African productive forces. Other occupants, and this is worth a discussion, unto itself. I'm really calling on everybody to read this entire chapter. I'm going to really rush through this and hoping I can get through the entire thing in enough time, leaving enough time for further discussion. But please look at this, read this. There are 1,000 issues that you can find in a single paragraph, and sometimes such as the one that I just read. So we say, millions of Africans have been forcibly dispersed from Africa throughout the world. Europeans and others have come to Africa, some as colonizers, some as subjects of colonial powers who were allowed privileges in Africa as intermediary colonial agents functioning as buffers between Africans and our oppressors, a situation contributing to absolute African dependency and the atrophy of African productive forces. Other occupants of Africans are descendants of the Arab conquest in Africa preceding that of Europe. How do these various forces fit into our definition of the African nation? First of all Black people forcibly transported to diverse parts of the world as part of the process giving rise to capitalism in the European nation are Africans, period. Secondly, all Black people throughout the world are potentially part of the African nation, whether they were part of the forcible dispersal or whether their presence in other places predates the assault on Africa. This includes Black people in Australia, India, and other places who generally experience a sense of sameness associated with African Blackness and the oppression we share because of our Blackness. Under imperialist world domination, Blackness is universally perceived as justification for our oppression. For those Africans forcibly dispersed from Africa, we are directly connected to each other by the parasitic capitalist world economy, under whose weight we continue to groan in poverty and oppression as the economic foundation of the European nation. All our cultural expressions found everywhere we are dispersed, music, dance, and other art forms and traditions have their foundation in Africa. The African nation and Arabs, whites, others in Africa. On the continent of Africa, our national homeland, there are many Europeans who came as colonizers. They have chosen to remain in Africa after nominal independence was declared in some territories, including Zimbabwe, Namibia, Kenya, and South Africa as prime examples. In South Africa, white people called themselves Africans prior to independence. Are these white people genuinely a part of the African nation by just declaring themselves so? The fact is that all Europeans, including those in Africa, are beneficiaries of the imperialist economy derived from African colonialism and slavery. This means they live at the expense of Africans. This places them concretely and objectively in the category of the European nation, even as they now may be forced to disguise their European national identity for the purpose of maintaining a parasitic attachment to Africa, that is a privileged attachment to Africa. This attachment of European colonizers to Africa objectively undermines the consolidation of the African nation, whose Blackness is an identifying badge of exploitation and oppression. This does not mean that whites from the colonizing nation cannot become a part of the African nation. What it does mean is that whites would have to commit national suicide, abandoning the interests of the European parasitic oppressive nation and uniting with the historical trajectory of the African nation to achieve Black power. Whites in Africa must unite with the capture of total economic and political power by African workers and a borderless continent. Power in the hands of African workers is the only way to unleash the productive forces of Africa, allowing Africa and Africans to engage fully in the process of producing life for Africa and Africans the world over. Objectively, this would mean white people in Africa would have to voluntarily relinquish to the African nation the vast resources they have accumulated through their past identification with the parasitic European nation. In the final analysis, the struggle against world capitalism, resting as it does on the exploitation of the majority of the peoples of the world, will require the destruction of the white or European nation that requires for its existence a parasitic relationship to the majority of humanity. It's a lot to be got from it. Please read that. The national liberation of African people will be a leading force in that destruction. The role of genuine white or European communists will be to actively engage in the commission of national suicide by becoming one with the national liberation of Africans and others. This is a far cry from the current positions of most self-declared white communists who talk instead about the need of the oppressed of the world to unite with their narcissistically defined European version of history. A similar situation is that of the Arabs, who came into Africa as conquerors, initiating their enslavement of African people that lasted 1,500 years and paved the way for the European transatlantic slave trade. Similar to Europeans, Arabs must embrace the historically necessary trajectory of Africa toward Black power as their own. We saw the potential for this kind of unity in the 1960s, when Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt stood as one of the strongest allies of Kwame Nkrumah in his attempt to create a united Africa. Ahmed Ben Bella, revolutionary fighter and first president of liberated Algeria, was another who cast his lot with the African nation. Both men shared with Africa a sense of sameness that showed promise for consolidating all of North Africa into the African nation. In addition to the practical examples of Nasser and Ben Bella, there is the example of Black Haiti, which upon achieving independence from France in 1804, created a constitution declaring citizenship and land ownership for Blacks only, but which defined whites, including the Poles who fought with Africans in the struggle for independence, as Black for the purpose of citizenship. This was a historic case of whites committing national suicide and consciously abandoning the pedestal upon which the European nation rests as a parasite on Africa and the world. This is a case of Europeans accepting as their own the struggle for the achievement of revolutionary Black power. We also mentioned the presence in Africa of people from India and other former colonies who were brought to the continent by the British for the express purpose of acting as a colonial buffer between the imperialists and the often resisting African masses. There are literally millions of Indians in Africa today, most of whom live at a much higher standard of living than both the majority of Africans and the majority of people in India. This shows how the pedestal upon which Europeans sit on our backs can be and has been opened up to petty bourgeois sectors of formerly colonized countries who now enjoy the benefits of white power at our expense. Thus, Arabs, Europeans, and residents of Africa from other European colonies can become Africans if they commit national suicide and abandon their parasitic relationship to African people. They must financially, politically, and in every other way unite with the leadership of and become one. They must financially, politically, and in every other way unite with the leadership of and become one with the African working class and the aims of a united and liberated Africa. We are Africans because we say we are. The African nation then is a community of people whose core identity is based on historical ties to the equatorial continent of Africa, contributing to a common culture, history, and physiognomy. The African nation is also comprised of all those African people who have been forcibly dispersed to various parts of the world through colonial slavery. Dispersed Africans are part of the process of the development of capitalism and the European nation, a process that requires our subjugation and national incoherence. Additionally, the African nation is comprised of many who experience a sense of sameness, a subjective connection to Africa mainly because of skin color that helps to define our imperialist-inspired, impoverished, and oppressed state of existence. The Dalit of India, the indigenous of Australia, and other areas where African presence goes back to earliest times, such as the Asia-Pacific region, are included in this category. Most people in India are included in this category. Finally, the African nation can include people of other nationalities living in Africa who commit national suicide, becoming part of the African working class and abandoning all allegiance to a predatory colonial relationship to African people. The truth, stated simply, is we are Africans, whatever else we may be called, because we say we are Africans and because we feel like we are Africans. Africa is the national homeland of all Black people worldwide. It is the land to which the identity of the African nation is firmly and irreversibly affixed. Our historical connection to Africa represents the critical elements of the material basis for African nationality. For although we have been forcibly dispersed by colonial slavery and the related factors subsequent to the initial European attack on Africa, our current conditions of existence, both in Africa and abroad, are essentially defined by the consequence of our forced dispersal. Here we remind ourselves that it was Europe that divided Africa with the illegitimate borders that now function to facilitate the theft of Africa's still vast resources by various imperial forces. The colonial division of Africa continues to separate Africans from each other and from our resources and that are being expropriated without cessation. The 54 delineated territories currently characterized as African nations were created in a conference held in Berlin, Germany in 1884-1885, attended by contending European states that parcel Africa out among themselves, resulting in the map that is known as Africa today. The result of this European invention has been the evolvement of a false national consciousness that fits the interests of the imperialists who created it at the expense of Africans ourselves. There were no pre-colonial borders separating Africans from each other. Now borders surround 54 colonially created entities, many of which cut right down the middle of ancient family or kinship territories, dividing and pitting against each other Africans that lived together for time immemorial. Clearly, this physical and psychological separation has facilitated Clearly, this physical and psychological separation has facilitated false national consciousness, not to mention a myriad of other traumas. The practical significance of this clarification concerning the African nation and its relationship to the European imperialist nation was discussed in our book, One People, One Party, One Destiny. Here's a quote. The anti-imperialist struggle of the world's peoples for repossession of our sovereignty and resources, both human and material, are the basis of the current deep crisis of imperialism. They are struggles to remove the pedestal upon which the entire rotten edifice of imperialism rests. They are struggles that enlist the vast majority of humanity, the laboring masses of every nation, in the creation of a new world without exploitation and oppression, without slaves and slave masters, and ultimately without borders. We recognize that the struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people, the struggle for the consolidation of the African nation, is ultimately a struggle that undermines the solidarity of the European nation state. We understand that under imperialism, those who were enslaved, colonized, and oppressed as a people would have to win liberation as a people. We are also clear that the successful nation-building struggles of Africans and others under the leadership of the working classes at the same time the beginning of the process of the withering away of nations. The European nation was born as a bourgeois nation at the expense of other people, of whole peoples and their territories. As we have seen in this discussion, it is a nation that requires the oppression and exploitation of whole peoples for its success and existence. Hence, African people have to resist the imperialist bourgeoisie as a people. Our assumption of consolidated nationhood will function to destroy the bourgeois nation. This is thus the rise of revolutionary worker nation states destroys the material basis for the existence of nations and borders that function to distinguish and separate one people from another. This is easier to understand when we finally realize the significance of the fact that capitalism at birth came wrapped in the skin of the racialized European nation state. It is this reality that made impotent the Marxist assumption of communism resulting from the withering away of the European bourgeois industrialized state. However, the fact that the European bourgeois nation state achieves life and definition from its relationship to Africa and the oppressed peoples of the world means that our victory over imperialism, with the African working class at the helm, will result in the withering away of nations. This will leave bare and make possible the withering away of the bourgeois state, which will have become historically redundant, unquote. Consolidating the African nation and building the African People's Socialist Party as the tool to achieve that goal must be at the top of the agenda of every African on earth. Every struggle must lead to this end. Every border must be broken down. The crisis of imperialism must be deepened daily. It is on the shoulders of the Africans alive today to complete the struggle that our people have waged for more than 500 years. The liberation of Africa and reunification of African people everywhere, the consolidation of the African nation, independence, unification, and socialism in our lifetime. Uhuru Karmat Akile. Yeah, go ahead, Karmat Akile. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Uhuru, well, did you want to say something before?
I was just going to say that this is really important. It's, you know, we're talking about a revolutionary party. We're not talking about a glee club or some other kind of group of happy people who get together. And often people have problems with us because we are a revolutionary party that people characterize as a Vanguard party. We characterize ourselves as the Advanced Detachment because we are structured a certain way and because we have certain kinds of principles of organization and that are designed to facilitate the capture of political power. We're a party that's talking about being in a confrontation with the most powerful country in the world, and perhaps in the history of humanity. And this is not something that can be done half-heartedly or carelessly. It requires discipline. It requires organizational principles, revolutionary organizational principles. It requires being connected to revolutionary theory. You must have revolutionary theory. You can have theory without making revolution, but you cannot have genuine revolution without theory. And this is who we are. And these revolutionary principles, these organizational principles are critical for success, for victory. And everybody, of course, can't be in the party, and we don't want everybody in the party. And we are clear about that. And sometimes, of course, there have been forces who bamboozle their way into the ranks of the party who did not have the wishes of the party, of the workers, of the oppressed peoples of Africa and the world at heart and at all. They were self-seeking, self-aggrandizing kinds of forces, sometimes with peculiar psychological disease that coming as a consequence of this relationship with colonial imperialism. Then, of course, there are the other hustlers, you know, the I'm talking about some who we refer to as opportunists. And all opportunists are not dishonest, and all opportunists are not hustler. We're talking now about a scientific definition. We say an opportunist is someone who sacrifices the long-term interest of the working class for some benefit, short-term benefit that might come from the petty bourgeoisie. So you can have an honest opportunist, but most of them that we deal with are not honest. They're like this guy, Barack Hussein Obama type. They're like some, who we run into all the time. They'll use words that speak to suggest struggle and resistance and revolution and things like that, like yes, we can, which, appropriated from the Mexican National Liberation Movement that Obama would use. And they would call change, 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 because they couldn't say revolution, but everybody was experiencing something like change was needed and was happening. And so to get in front of the question that attract the masses, that may even have revolutionary connotations, they would take it. And people do that with African internationalism, not philosophy. I mean, they have to be sane enough to know that we recognize it when they do it, but they do it, anyway, because their objective is not to build the revolution, build the revolutionary party it's to build themselves and whatever other thing that they're going to that diverts people from the revolution. So these are critical questions, and one of the most fundamental struggles we're involved in right now at this very moment with this crisis of imperialism, because during the crisis of imperialism, when imperialism is in crisis, every entity that has a stake in the continuing existence of the social system comes to its defense. And sometimes it comes to its defense trying to look like the rest of us. That's what neocolonialism is. Neocolonialism comes to the defense of colonialism, but it can't do it outright because everybody's now saying kill the white devils. So they have to become black devils. They have to become white devils in black skin, that kind of stuff. And that happens. The Chinese used to call it using the red flag to fight the red flag. Well, we have instances where people use the red, black, and green flag to fight the red, black, and green flag. So they will appropriate everything they can. Slogans that they might tweak, other concepts that they have to deal with, because clearly the line is such that it attracts masses of people. So they say, how can I adopt aspects of the line that will bring people into the net, taking them away from the revolutionary leadership of the African working class and lead them into this swamp of opportunism where they intend to go and where they do go. So these are questions of theory, this question of organizational principles and the responsibility of the party to make every effort to advance this struggle and hold fast to our ideological and organizational principles. That's what it is that's so profoundly significant about these studies and what it is that we have to do as a party and a movement. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Well, I just really want to appreciate this study and appreciate even the portion that you just did just now, just in terms of really expressing the significance of, what it is that we're doing with the Omali Taught Me Sunday studies. And we are now going to enter into the Ask the Chairman segment. So it's a full hour of you guys being able to pose your questions where the chairman will take them, answer them live. So take this opportunity right now to type your questions into the chat, either on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll discuss them here. So before we get into that, I want to acknowledge where people are viewing from. We have Brooklyn, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, San Diego, California, Occupied Azania, Lakeland, Florida, Tampa, Florida, Pinellas Park, Florida, Ghana, Bermuda, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Kuwait, Boston, Massachusetts, United Kingdom, Hempstead, New York, Noonan, Georgia, Lawrenceville, Georgia, Duluth, Georgia, Huntsville, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, Newark, New Jersey, St. Petersburg, Florida, Nigeria, and Oakland, California. So uhuru to all of our comrades watching wherever it is you're located. We also had a comment from Benjamin Prado, who is the Secretary General of the Mexican Liberation Organization, Unión do Barrio. Says, uhuru, comrades, good morning. Long live the African People's Socialist Party and the African Revolution. Uhuru, Benjamin. So what Oh, we also have Jackson, Mississippi. They just noted where they are. So yeah, continue to let us know where you're watching from, because we love to be able to acknowledge that and just to express, the ability of African internationalism to spread wherever it is we are. So the first question's coming from Comrade Matsamela in San Diego, who asked, Chairman, can you speak on how neo-colonial opportunists have played on the presence of Asians and Arabs in Africa and African colonies for reactionary and opportunistic motives? Conversely, Rodney, Biko, and you have laid out principled ways forward. How can this be applied to us in North America?
Uhuru. I think that might be a relatively complicated question, but I think there's an obvious, for me, aspect of truth here. There are forces that we have a relationship with at different times who call themselves Pan-Africanists and who talk about freeing African people, but who have a visceral attack on Arabs. And they were used as part of the basis of that, the fact that Arabs did engage in colonial slavery, and then they would lump, did engage in the trans-Saharan slave trade, and then they would lump all Arabs together and make all the African workers and peasants and things like that who themselves subjected to cruel despotic rule by Arab bourgeoisie, and they won't just make that distinction. And then, but the fundamental error that's made there is not recognizing a fundamental error that today's world is one that is characterized by the existence and hegemony of a capitalist world social system. The whole world is dominated by capitalism, and that's the world in the Middle East, that's in North Africa, that's every place we are located. That's even the Arab despots play minor roles under the leadership of white power imperialism. Saudi Arabia, this phony thing that's just occurred between Israel and the UAE. Is that it? This United Arab Emirate that they're formally having some kind of relationship that Trump and Netanyahu from Israel are celebrating. What they're talking about is all of these forces live under US colonial imperial domination. And if it were possible to engage in a struggle with Arabs and achieve liberation for African people, that's one thing. But this is diversionary. It is at the same time that these forces are claiming that that Arabs can't be a part of the struggle for Africa, that the Arabs in North Africa cannot be. Some say you can't say all Africa because you got to cut off North Africa and just fight for Africa, south of the Sahara, which is nonsense, And we've seen, I've quoted here some evidence of people like Ben Bella and others, and who took profoundly, and even Nasser took profoundly more progressive stances for the unification of Africa under the leadership of African Revolution than the majority of the so-called leaders in Africa who refused to stand with Nkrumah, who was trying to make that effort. So on a practical level, that's nonsense. But also, again, we're talking about the fact that Africa and the world is dominated by a world capitalist economy, not some Arab Muslim economy, the world capitalist economy. And that dominates in most of this, all of the so-called Arab countries as well. And we've seen that. We've seen what they've done in just recently in Libya. We've seen what they're doing in Syria. We've seen what they're doing in most of the Arab territories and in North Africa itself. So that is nonsensical. Africa for Africans, and we say from Cape to Cairo, from top to bottom. That's Africa and our objective. And we've defined what the African nation is. We've given serious definition to it that includes those who might have been considered as Arab people. So it's opportunism. And it's opportunism in that it would target Arabs without distinguishing rulers and masters of Arab people, and with the assumption that the Arab masters have the same objective interests as the Arab rulers, which is not the case in any way. And then they would liquidate and absolve these neo-colonial puppet Negroes south of the Sahara. So the Arabs become the question, never mind neo-colonialism. I had a contest. I didn't want this. I was on my way to the airport while in Ghana, and this sort of an outdoor mass meeting was happening. And Chinwe Use, who was a really influential writer out of Nigeria. He wrote an incredibly important book that impressed the hell out of me one time. I saw some weaknesses, but it was an impressive book for the time. And he was holding court. And he was one of those who was putting forth the whole idea of this Arab confrontation that we were involved in. At the same time, the United States was trying to win as much support as it could to make against the Arab and Muslims, in North Africa and in the Middle East and what have you. And in other words, they were facilitating this whole struggle. And there was somebody else who almost came into the party at one juncture who held that same view. And it was that view that kept him out, because it was almost like the CIA that was putting forth that line. And then, of course, in this country, in the United States, we've had people who would be, land grabbers. They come up with this notion of we are new Africans. We referenced this already, that somehow we are born again Americans, something like that, and that would claim the lands and territories and resources of the people whose oppression in this hemisphere is defined by genocide and the theft of their land. So that would objectively put us on the same side of those forces. It would create a kind of neo-Zionism, where you go and steal somebody's land and claim they weren't doing anything with it, or they weren't there, or somehow we've been here for a long time picking cotton, and therefore it now belongs to us, something like that. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'm sorry, Masamela. I hope that helped a bit, Uhuru. Go ahead.
Uhuru. Our next question comes from Marcus Louison on YouTube. Asks, does your socialist revolution still use money as a means of exchange? My concern is with money as a serious corrupting force, irrespective of the social system in play. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I'm not sure that money is a serious corrupting force, irrespective, as you put it, of a social system. I'm not sure about that. But I know money will exist for a while under socialism. I think we'll see the disappearance of money, because money is simply a symbol of value that makes it unnecessary for somebody to take a refrigerator to a farm to exchange it for 3 cows or something like that. Because really, what money does, especially where you have a commodity production, where it makes it unnecessary for the producers to come directly in contact with each other to exchange the value. I don't have to exchange my chickens for your chair. I have this money that's equal in value to X numbers of chickens, X numbers of chairs, and stuff like that. So I think that for a while, even under socialism, that will happen. Now, I want to say under socialism, because to be clear, when we talk about socialism, we're just talking about that time where the working class has assumed control of society, where the working class has now become the ruling class, and where the workers collectively and socially own and control the means of production. That's not the same as communism. Communism, socialism, that's pre-communist, that place prior to communist coming into existence, communism coming into existence. With the advent of communism, of course, the state disappears. With socialism, it's the workers now become the state. The working class now becomes the armed state. And the state is repressive and coercive, and has other kinds of contradictions that we have to recognize, because the state has to be gotten away with, but you can't get away with the state until you collectivize all the production and the things in society and have the ability to protect ourselves from the bourgeoisie that's just been overthrown, that's going to do everything it can to destroy what we've created. But so for a time after the advent of socialism, we're going to see, I believe we're going to see money. Perhaps we'll see money, but even under capitalism, as we're moving, as things are moving, money is disappearing. I mean, there's some places that you can't even go and spend money. I mean, but you can take a card or something like that, So how that looks is changing already, but I know that probably for a while after the workers capture political power, and I'm assuming that's going to be sooner rather than later, that currency money will exist.
Uhura, thank you, Chairman. The next question comes from Yejide Odomila, who sits on the party's Central Committee as the president of the African National Women's Organization. She asks, Chairman, I appreciate the part where you said that we should not romanticize Africa and the explanation of class assignment based on need. In an attempt to emphasize the strength of Africa and Africans, Black people commonly hold up kings and queens in Africa as a pre-colonial reality or a desire for African life. Does the party have a position on this line of African kings and queens?
Well, first of all, I am not sure if kings and queens were terms that were used for African leaders. When the colonizers came to Africa, they gave African leaders the designation that was something that was common to Europe. So if Europe, a leader was called a king, and then they ran into an African leader who may have been elevated to significance as a consequence of age, and as Zikirbo was mentioning there, they would attribute this, they would characterize this person as king too. And they would take over and they would actually install people and keep people in those kinds of positions. So I'm not sure that those entities like that existed. I know that one thing, Africans have been desperate under colonial domination to say that we are more than just people who pick cotton. We are more than just people, who shine your shoes and do all your dirty work and everything. And it's because Europe has elevated this concept of kings and queens, and there's all this pageantry associated with it. Even in the 21st century, we see people, bemoaning the fact that some Negro who was married to some white guy in England who was supposed to be part of royalty, has had to leave the castle. And the thing is that we have working and poor people, ordinary people, who want to be valuable, who want to be, significant, who will take up these terms that's been used by Europeans. And in the party, we detest those concepts of kings and queens. We are opposed to it because, kings and queens are parasites. They live off other people's labor and stuff and don't produce anything for themselves. The vast majority of African people are working people, are peasants who grind and eke out existence for ourselves. And then, as we mentioned, in African traditional society, there was a collective situation. It wasn't like somebody just sitting on a throne. We see these caricatures sometimes in parts of Africa today, who just sitting on thrones issuing out orders. So we believe that the working people are the primary forces in society. And that's who we hold up and elevate. And that's hard for a lot of Africans and other people because slavery has really smeared the concept of labor. And Black people working under force, under the gun and the whip and what have you. Nobody wanted to be that. Nobody wants to be that. Even the concept of labor, which is absolutely essential for any existing society. Everything that is produced happens through labor, but nobody wants to be a laborer anymore because of its connotation with Black people slavery. So Black people don't want it, other people don't want it. I was in Germany once, and this guy was a barber at a military base where I was stationed. And his name was Fritz. So if you want to, I mean, that's an extraordinary, you know, what do you call it? And he would show up to work every day, and he'd come, you know, in his suit and his briefcase. He had a briefcase. He'd come to work as the barber. And then he'd get there, you know, he'd put on his barber's outfit, and his lunch was in his briefcase. But nobody wants to be associated with labor and laborers. So we say the real heroes in any society are the producers of value. Those are the people who get dirty, get down and dirty, who do the work, sometimes get dirty. And the people, you know, who put food on our tables and build our houses and automobiles and things like that. These are the real heroes of society. And it's from them and this process of production that society learns everything. Science flows from that, philosophy flows from that, everything from that process of production. So now we don't, you know, promote this whole concept of kings and queens and what have you. In fact, even in Europe, they went through a period of off with their heads when they were talking about the royalty there. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Our next question comes from Ridge Francis on YouTube. Asks, how can we help to push the colonizers out of Africa while living in the Western world? And how do you think Iran's ability to buy and sell weapons will affect Africans' ability to defend themselves? I guess it's a two-part. Well,
Iran buying and selling weapons, affecting Africa's ability to defend itself.
Yeah, that was the second part of the question, but
yeah. I think this is why you say we have, the African Revolution is seamless. And this is the struggle that we have against Pan-Africanists and against the others who hyphenated Africans inside the United States, who claim this territory, that territory. We have a seamless revolutionary movement, and there's a powerful strategic significance of being located right here in the United States, because the fact is that almost everything bad happens in Africa either has its source the United States, or is supported by the United States, something to that effect. So there's a powerful strategic value of Africans being in the United States as long as we are associated with an African revolutionary project. There's some people who cheer the fact that they're against AFRICOM and stuff like that. Well, yeah, be against AFRICOM. You should be against AFRICOM, but that's not the real statement. The statement is that we have to have an African revolutionary movement that's in Africa and in here. We will not rescue Africa from America by doing that. We will rescue Africa by being part of an African revolution that's based in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the United States, and so that every component, every struggle we're involved in has a strategic character. And it has a single leadership, just as the Garvey movement created. And Garvey was the one who said that, you know, if an African is assaulted someplace by a European in this place, and we push a button and Africa can respond from another place in the African world. We have a strategic approach to our revolutionary movement, and that's what it is that we have to be about. So you want to do that, you join the African People's Socialist Party if you meet the criteria, and if you are willing to do what it takes to be a member of the party, to acquire the discipline, to come to grapple with revolutionary theory and science and tactics and strategy. All of that goes into it, to the leadership. And even if you don't want to come into the party, if you want to be a part of the Uhuru movement that is also involved in making this revolution wherever we are in the world, that's how it's going to happen. It will happen because we have a strategic approach to every place we are in the world, whether it's in Jamaica, whether it's in Bermuda, Nassau, and what have you. We're fighting from one front, and we're using all of our resources strategically to deal with this enemy that we have. So there are some places we won't have the mobility. We won't have, because the oppression is so deep in some places, but we'll have more freedom in other places where we can make it happen against someone who's oppressing us in this specific place. Equatoria, well, I'm thinking about French, what is it called? French Guinea in the Caribbean. Is that how it's characterized? where the repression, the French colony is still existing in the Caribbean, where people are viciously oppressed. And there are other places like New Papua and other places where the repression may be at any given time so severe that they can't move a certain way, but we can move a certain way in some places else. And we have to have the strategic ability to affect our enemies, no matter where they're located, even if we can't do it in that particular place. That's what African internationalism and the African Socialist Internationalists provide us with.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you so much. Our next question comes from, oh, someone said French Guyana. Oh, that
French Guyana, French Guyana. Yeah, that's Massimela, you're always on the case. Massimela's always there. Every time he puts the information there. Yes, comment, Massimela. That's what I'm thinking about, French Guyana.
Uhuru. Our next question comes from Abdul Malik Mikhail on Facebook. It says, question, would you say that communism and socialism already existed prior to Marx and Lenin labeling or defining the ideology? Also, what is your answer to those that say socialism and communism was created by Zionist Jews?
I don't have an answer to what Zionist Jews did. I mean, like I know that the Ford automobile was created by a white man who was really sympathetic to the Nazis and stuff like that. But I used it when it was necessary to get around. I would use it. But I know that communism and socialism was not created by Zionist Jews. But that's not the basic thing. To the point that you raised in terms of what socialism and communism, did he say something that was African?
Basically, existed prior to Marx and Lenin.
I think that's part of what I quoted the comrade Kizerbo earlier on about traditional African society that was not based on like private property and et cetera, and the state that responds to it. I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. In fact, Engels used for much of what he wrote about how communism would look, something that was written by this guy Morgan from the United States, who was an anthropologist who has studied the Iroquois and certain other societies. And Engels came to a conclusion about the nature about the development of human society, in part based on an assumption that since European society was the highest society, then what they were looking in terms of the Iroquois, where there was no oppression of women, where there was no exploitation of people, and they call this primitive, kind of primitive communism. And that had not yet developed to the state that you saw in Europe. So even this practical expression of what they characterize as communism, the only place they saw it was someplace outside of Europe. It never was a European phenomenon. So I don't debate that at all.
Uhuru. The next question comes from Hennock in Bermuda. It says, Uhuru, Chairman, please explain how the white nation was established based on theft, basically, and our incoherence. Why is racism of little importance in our struggle?
Thank you, Comrade Hennock. Hennock's doing great work in Bermuda. We really appreciate the work you're doing. We appreciate all those comrades who are working with you there in Bermuda to put the presence of the party down. But as we said during the study that we've, the readings that we've, this whole chapter 10 that we've been looking at, is that the European nation came about through the process of development of capitalism itself. And capitalism itself was born through the colonial enslavement and colonialism around the peoples of the world. And the capitalist nation, the bourgeois, it was the bourgeois nation. This gives birth to what they call the bourgeoisie, which is the capitalist class of folk. It comes into existence because it was absolutely necessary as a superstructure to a system that now has freed the the European peasants and serfs from the land where they had been trapped and held by feudalism. And that was the power, that was the state power. But now they have to be free enough to leave the land and go out and sell the value of their labor to the highest bidder, because there's a new force in town now, this entrepreneur, if you will, this new group of bandits and thieves who are stealing resources from Africa and then rebuilding and bringing all these resources to Europe, and they become so powerful that they overthrow the old feudal order. And in overthrowing the old feudal order, they have to free up the workers and the peasants and serfs who were tied to the land so they can work in these factories that's growing there now. But what makes them loyal then to the bourgeoisie? What makes them loyal to their new ruling class? Because there's no longer this feudal lord that's sitting on top of them. There's no longer the sheriff from Nottingham. They become, quote unquote, free. And what makes them loyal is this their capacity of this new ruling class to give them a sense of sameness, the flag and other kinds of things, you know, that unites them and gives them a national consciousness that destroys, that makes the primary, not the contention that the Europeans had among and with each other, but now this contention, which is strategic and fundamental, that they have with the people who they are enslaving. This is where they get a sense of sameness, partially in part of the process of colonialism and slavery. This is what initiated things like zoos to the extent they began to pop up all over Europe. This is where booty that was brought from these exotic places where these so-called explorers and thieves were going to. In fact, they brought Black people back. In Belgium and some other places that they even had Africans in zoos, you know, behind these glass cages where white people literally living there, and set up a pseudo family setting where white people can come and see Africans under these circumstances. So this is, so we see the rise of this sense of sameness, and then it rests upon this foundation of this newly emerged capitalism that locks it into place. This is what gives them a sense of identity and unity. So that's where it comes from. This is the pedestal upon which it sits. And you know, the rulers now, they have control of the process of education, of information, and they influence everything that we know about each other and about other peoples around the world. So that's the first aspect of it. You have this nation, and that it defines itself now primarily in relationship to us. And it gives us a definition that suits its needs. It suits its needs. It's not real. And this is one of the problems that they have, that they don't quite get, because we are not who they say we are. But this is who they say they are, is what defines how they act toward us and what they do toward us, which is why they always underestimate us, which is why, because we ain't nothing but niggers, you know, and so anyway, this is the basis of the foundation of the European nation, and the struggle for emancipation, for our own freedom, taking back our resources, takes away the material foundation, material basis for that. And then the subjective factor of this national identity is also affected by the fact that we begin now, we are no longer being passive objects of history, we become subjects of history. So it's not somebody who's defined by them, but we are now defining ourselves and defining them as a part of the process. So when we say that we are Africans, we're not just saying who the hell we are, we're saying you ain't who you said you are either. And so it's a whole fundamental thing that's happening. And I don't think I did justice to the question that you just raised, but I hope I touched on it. Is there an aspect of it that I didn't address at all? What did you say?
I will double check, but I think that was, oh, and well, there was a second part of the question. Why is racism of little importance in our struggle?
Yeah, because this whole thing about racism is such a phony thing. It just keeps the white colonizer in the center of everything. So you're not trying to become free. You're just trying to make white people like you. That the basic problem that you have is an ideological problem. It's that the white people don't like you, how white people define you. And the fact is, the problem that we have is that they've appropriated for themselves our power, our resources. And so you can't get your resources back. You know, it's a pure, abstract, nonsensical thing that keeps white people in the center and then makes it unnecessary for those in our midst to fight against the actual material conditions that we are suffering from. And we fight against this phony concept that says the material condition we're suffering from is called white people don't like us. It relieves us of the responsibility of doing what has to be done, is to take our own power. You didn't see the Vietnamese fighting against racism. You don't see the Chinese who've come to power fighting against racism. You don't see any other people in the world, you know, who achieve power, who recognize that they were oppressed, winning that power by fighting against the ideas in the heads of white people. You know, so it's just ridiculous. Yeah.
For real. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that point, Chairman. The next question comes from Alikia Ngoma, who I have to also say, because I might have to be self-critical later if I don't, that she also mentioned French Guiana. I think she actually said it before Matsamela. I just didn't catch it. So anyway.
Okay, Matsamela.
But she asked, a lot of African subgroups, so to speak, believe that consolidating one African identity is to erase all of the other cultural expressions. Can you talk about the flaw in that kind of thinking?
Yeah, well, one thing, a nation is not the only identity people have. People have various identities, even under being a part of the same nation. And even the US pretends to be a nation, and it's not a nation, by the way. It's nothing close to that. But you know, you've got Christians, and there's an assumption that there are Muslims based on their own self-definition, and you know, all these other people. So within a nation, you know, you have other identities, but they're just not the primary identity. Like in Africa, in particular, the fact that that our world is so small, and our world, and I say small in part because most of us are restricted to the communities, the villages that we live in, and our economic and political references and relationships are so limited that you know, we can see the world as, you know, being based on what ethnic identity we have. And most of the ethnic identities become significant because much of the production began there within the ethnic group. And that helped to, you know, shape how we understood things, and our myths, et cetera, sometimes, you know, revolved around that relationship. But the fact is that the African nation is so much broader and richer. It's so much richer when you think about the experiences of African people rooted on the continent of Africa. But we left Africa and we were pushed into Brazil, we were pushed into Haiti, we were pushed in all these other places, and we took Africa with us there. And then we've developed, you know, expressions, cultural and otherwise, based on what we found there. So we couldn't find the exact thing that we ate when we were at home, and what came to be Angola, but we found it. We found something that's similar, with something to substitute. We have enriched the culture of Africa, has been made much richer by all of these other reflections, and so the nation is not is the primary identity. It doesn't liquidate the fact that you had experiences as Zulu. It doesn't liquidate the fact that you had, you know, experiences as Fulani or something to that. It's enriched. This becomes a part of the overall national identity of Africa. And much of this will, with the destruction of these borders, you see that much of this will disappear. Well, will be, what do you call it, subsumed, will become a part of a greater identity. If you can call it disappearance in that fashion, it becomes part of a greater identity of the African nation. So that it's not just you got to be this or you got to be that. That's a European concept. That's a whole European undialectical way, which is to say there's a metaphysical way of looking at the world. Uhuru.
For real. Matsumello came back with another question, says Uhuru Chairman, related to yesterday's question. I've seen so much time wasted to discover the term used for the African landmass during antiquity. They say it was Alkebulan or all these other terms. You say we are Africans because we say we are. I love that so much. You also say we can decide what to call Africa after we win victory. Can you speak to this?
I mean, that's the case. I mean, that's a whole diversionary thing. You know, when you're talking about making revolution, anyway, so you want to liquidate. I mean, Nkrumah was talking about uniting Africa. Garvey talked about Africa for Africans at home and abroad. Lumumba, you know, this incredible letter that he wrote to his wife as he was being, as they were preparing to murder him, talks about how Africa will be free. And so the thing is that this has been a slogan that's and a term, a concept that African people ourselves have used to forward the concept of our liberation and freedom. So it's not like South Africa, which is something that the white people put on and defined us as being. It's not like Nigeria, that this white woman, you know, created a nigger area and what have you. Africans have you know, put forth this concept. And in fact, in one of the Garvey meetings, as we know, in 1920, it may have been, at that Convention of Negro Peoples of the World, one sister stood up and said that, you know, we should stop calling ourselves Negro, because we should even call ourselves Ethiopians or Africans. We are Africans. And so this is a definition that we're talking about that's come in the heat of struggle. It's not something that was done in the academy or some culturalist came up and said, let's call ourselves this or that. It's in the heat of struggle. And if African people in the process of making this revolution can do so, making a revolution that overturns our oppression, our real oppression in the real world, it is not, people are not fighting to erase one name and put another name on. People are fighting to overturn these horrible conditions of existence imposed on us by white power. If we can do that as Africans, I say right on. I'm with Garvey, I'm with Lumumba, I'm with Nkrumah, I'm with all these other people who've been able to fight for Africa and who fight for Africa every day of our existence on the continent. So, you know, and then, you know, after the revolution, I mean, this can be stuff in one of the universities that we set up that Masamela or somebody like that is presiding over. We can have courses in what we want to call Africa. Are we satisfied with this and that kind of stuff? Let it be that kind of discussion where it might be helpful, but in this struggle right now, it's not even a helpful discussion. Uhuru.
Uhuru, yes. Professor Masamela. Uhuru. Our next question, we have about, just want to say about 13 more minutes, Chairman, for questions. So that's also a message to all of you watching, 13 more minutes. So go ahead.
Did we get to the questions that were left over from the last time as well?
No, we haven't gotten to those yet. Do you want?
We should.
Okay.
Yeah, because otherwise they'll go another week without being addressed.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, well, then let's take a look at that then, since we are down to close. So we had questions from last week that were not able to be taken. So we're going to take them right now. One question was from Nasir Alamin, who's located in Kuwait, on Facebook, asked, does the chairman think there is a distinction between the Pan-Africanism of Du Bois and that of Kwame Ture?
Uhuru, thank you, Comrade Nasir. It's good to hear from. No, there's no distinction. You should read. I forgot what book it is. Kwame. I knew Kwame. I knew him when he was Stokely, and I knew him when he became Shaka, and you know, I had very warm feelings about Kwame, but he was wrong as hell, and he was a petty bourgeois Pan-Africanist. And I'm not just saying this now. This is struggles that we had with Stokely, and he was my leader. I was a member of SNCC. I was so, you know, he was Stokely Carmichael like nobody could be Stokely Carmichael at a very critical time in the history of our struggle. But he was wrong, and there's no distinction between Du Bois' Pan-Africanism and Kwame's Pan-Africanism. And I wrote something about Kwame after he died, and it's in one of the books. It may be Omali Shatella Speaks. I'm not sure, but somebody's going to say it before this is over. Somebody will remind us. But yeah, his was the same. I mean, from Burning Spear Media, That's from Omali Shatella Speaks. That's what it was in. So Burning Spear Media let us know that. So so I really loved Kwame. I really loved Kwame, but he was a petty bourgeois, Pan-Africanist, just like Du Bois was. And so no, there was no difference.
No. Next question came from Don Diallo de la Vegas on Facebook. Says, Uhuru Chairman, what do you think about the INFACT, that's the Not Messing Around Coalition, and the likes of African people rising to defend themselves even within legal means?
Well, here's the issue. Self-defense, the way we usually understand it, and the way INFACT has talked about it, is not revolutionary. It's really important for people to defend ourselves, and I think that is something exciting and liberating for African people who've been beaten down and been and have had these phony leaders that's existed since the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 1960s that tell us that there's something morally significant and powerful about being killed by white people and white power by oppressors. So the notion of killing the oppressor is a really exciting notion. So that's important. That's important. But I think that there's a way that the question can be mishandled. And because what we're talking about is revolution. And as I think Mao Zedong that says in the War of National Liberation, any act, the thing is any act by the oppressed, by the colonized against the colonized is self-defense. It's self-defense. Colonialism is violent. And so there's a way that you can handle this question of self-defense that presupposes that if the white cop wasn't shooting us on the streets, or if the white people didn't come into church to kill us, that things were kind of cool, all right. And we're saying that the whole setup is wrong, is rotten, and that masses of people have to be won to a revolutionary consciousness to overturn this social system. That is, everything about it is violent. What happens to us in the school, violent. What happens to us even with this process that what they say they're doing good for you with welfare, but you can't have the man in the house, you can't, have this and that. Is violent. Violence is a humiliation on a daily basis. And the gun is one reflection of rejection to that. And self-defense is absolutely important and necessary. Every African should get a gun or two or three or bazookas if you can get them. Anything that you can. Living under colonial domination, you need it. And so I'm not trying to detract from that at all, but we can't confuse somebody with guns as being revolutionary. And that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, so protect yourself, arm yourself. And if there's much that you can learn about getting your community together for self-defense, do that. So that we can defend ourselves under circumstances, but that's no substitute for revolution. So if you get 100, 300, 1,000 people who will come into a particular city and talk tough, that's no substitute for what the mass of people have to do to overturn a social system. And it can deflect, if you're not careful, attention from the fact that the responsibility is to build a revolutionary project that brings the masses in. A revolution is in such circumstances such as what we live in, is not going to be made by simply frontal assaults, this frontal attack, of the army of the bourgeoisie. And if the bourgeoisie, should decide that this 300 or 500 or 1,000 Africans dressed in black with guns in this particular place, if it should come to that conclusion, it could wipe it out in a single instance. The war of the fleet, the guerrilla is actually going to be the instrument through which we break down the whole social system and expose its weaknesses, and even such as what we saw with this comrade, was it in Dallas, Texas? Micah, was it Micah, was it Johnson?
Micah Xavier Johnson?
Was it, yeah, was it Micah in Dallas, Texas? I mean, just one person, you saw what he was able to do, just one person, and how he confused them. They had to go to the office to get some bombs and use a robot. They couldn't even attack this guy in person. So that says something about the guerrilla. And we saw that in 1972, I think it was, in New Orleans, where one brother in New Orleans held up the whole New Orleans Police Department. But the thing is, self-defense is necessary. Do what you can. Organize if you can. Organize armed groups of people who can protect your communities and who can protect yourselves, because these people will kill us, and they do kill us on a regular basis. And we have to protect ourselves from white civilians, and we have to protect ourselves from white people who wear uniforms and say that they're sent by the government. We have to be able to protect ourselves from all of them. So right on to that. I'm just saying that that's one thing, and it's really important for us to understand it, but there is no substitution. And we have, as a part of our demands, when we talk about tactics and strategy, we call for the development of an African People's Liberation Army. That's at the command of a revolutionary process, revolutionary organization. So that's right on. And so I don't know that much about, in fact, the group, except every now and then I understand that the leader of the organization, comes on and talks about, how they're experts, and they come in and give a city demands to get this straight. We're going to come back and do this and that and what have you. And I don't know any history of struggle, I don't know what their political program is. I don't know what their leadership looks like in terms of structures or anything like that. I don't know. So I can't say that much. I think that the notion of self-defense is extraordinarily important. And I think for a lot of people, to see those comrades out there with guns was something that was morale boosting, and all for that. But the Panthers, was the most recent historical example of armed African people. But we knew what their program was. We knew something about their leaders, and it wasn't just arms. They did other things that to bring African people into some kind of revolutionary process. They tried to anyway. So I don't think that's even a good comparison. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. So we will take this last question, and I'm taking it because I think it, when you mentioned the War of the Flea, it kind of goes into this next question. So this was asked by Given Leto on YouTube. It says, how can Africa gain its independence in the face of the likes of the US, France, British military might? So I just thought.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, is that someone who's in South Africa, occupied Tanzania? Do you know?
They didn't say where they were located.
What's the name again?
Given Leto.
Given Leto. Okay. So that's why we are. I mean, the oppressed never has the arms of the oppressor. The Vietnamese took on the French. They may have had 1 or 2 guns or something like that. They had rocks and sticks. And one stick can take a gun or 2, and then 1 or 2 guns can take 2 or 3 more guns from dead oppressors. And this is how the oppressed people usually accumulate weapons to fight against the oppressor. But the fact is that it's going to take, generally speaking, the guerrilla that will make this revolution possible. It's not a matter of confronting equal powers against each other. The fact is, increasingly, you don't see powers in the world who approximate any kind of equality in terms of strength confronting each other. In fact, they avoid each other, and they fight through proxies. They use us to fight each other in their interest. Even as you look at this contest between China and the United States now, given a choice, they will not fight each other, because that is going to be cataclysmic for them and for the world. What will happen in every instance, they'll try to use us. We have to use us. We can wear them down. And we see already a crisis in the social system without us even picking up a single 50 caliber machine gun to shooting anybody. We are forcing them now. The whole system is in a state of crisis because we are the foundation. And there are ways that we can move. And don't mistake it. We're going to have to fight them. And I'm saying this in terms of the person who was talking about the organization of armed protesters, as well as this particular question. We're going to have to fight. There's no way we're going to get out of this without fighting. But the revolution is based on tactics and strategy, that part of which is that you're working all the time to undermine the power and influence of your enemies. You're creating splits, and they are split. And part of the split that exists between them at different times is because each of them want the same thing, us. And they want our resources. And depending how we move at any given time, they will do some of the fighting against each other for us. But we just have to be clear what the hell it is that we are about. And no, we are not going to be able to match them in that fashion, gun for gun. The Vietnamese didn't do it, but they beat them. And others have had to fight them, and they've done so victoriously. We will have to do it too. There's no way we're going to get out of this without fighting. I want to say that. So I'm hoping the question did not suggest that because the French and the United States and all these people are kind of together, and they are kind of together, that it's impossible to win. We're going to have to win despite whatever kind of unity they appear to have at any given moment. Because how we fight, we'll see that it will disrupt the unity that they have. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much for that answer, Chairman. And we are down to the end of time. Did you want to say anything before we close out with announcements?
Well, just as really the imperialists are down to the end of time, but no, I really appreciate having this opportunity to speak to these comrades, and you're going to have to help me remember the names of people who raise some of the questions when that happens, and I hope we'll be able to get to most of the questions next time. Uhuru.
Uhuru, yes. Thank you so much, Chairman, for your time in answering those questions. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you, and we'll make sure that the Chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For revolutionary news and analysis, you can visit theburningspear.com. And join us for the entire month as we celebrate Black August, a month of African resistance. During Black August, the Burning Spear newspaper conducts an annual fundraiser to keep the spear burning, the revolutionary Black Power print and online journal in constant production since 1968. Help us reach our fundraising goal by donating at theburningspear.com/BlackAugust. Contribute to the Mafundi Lake Sponsor a Prisoner Program, where we ship to over 500 prisoners for free. Participate in our August spear sales competition and win some one-of-a-kind collector's items. And tune in August 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern for a virtual culture event, Africa Speaks for Itself, a night of poetry and storytelling with African cultural workers across the world, celebrating 100 years since the adoption of the red, black, and green flag to represent the African nation by Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, and will feature a keynote presentation from our very own Chairman Omali Yeshitela. For Revolutionary Radio, dynamic shows and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via our Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. If you're united with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party, visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. And order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the book that we were reading from today, at burningspearmarketplace.com. Tomorrow in St. Louis at 10 a.m. Central Time, community residents and leaders of Ward 21 and other areas of North St. Louis will hold a press conference to denounce the underhanded shenanigans of the LRA administration and Alderman John C. Muhammad to halt the progress of the Black Power Blueprint toward uplifting our long neglected community. Community leaders and speakers include Tachara Masimba in Columbai and Annette. So if you are in St. Louis, I'm able to make that again, that's tomorrow, 10 a.m. Central. On Wednesday, August 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, join an online study with the African People's Solidarity Committee Chairwoman, Penny Hess. The study will examine how white women's liberation has been built on murder and torture of African people, and will include discussion of the book, They Were Her Property, by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. Register at bit.ly they were her property and spread the word about this important study. On Sunday, August 30th, Uhuru Foods and Pies hosts Baking for a Black Power conference. Be a part of building an independent African economy. Learn more about this conference by visiting uhurupies.org. The International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement invites you to their annual convention, Build the African Nation. 100 years later, it's still red, black, and green. Taking place September 11th through the 13th, NPDUM is calling on you to fight for Black Power and register for free at NPDUM 2020, that's INPDUM 2020.eventbrite.com. We're calling on all people to follow the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to COVID-19. APDEP has recently launched an international telehealth program, a free resource for African people to get our COVID-19 related questions and concerns answered by licensed doctors and nurses through Project Black Ankh. You can make your free virtual appointment with one of our professional health providers by going to developmentforafrica.org/telehealth. Lastly, to keep up with our movement events, visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.